Rejection in relationships is often seen as a final outcome, but in real human behavior, it is not always as permanent or linear as people assume. Many men experience situations where a woman initially shows disinterest, declines a connection, or steps away, only to return later with renewed communication or attention. This pattern can feel confusing, especially when the initial message seems clear. However, human emotions, attraction, and decision-making are not always fixed states. They often shift over time based on reflection, circumstance, and emotional recalibration. From a psychological perspective, rejection does not always mean complete emotional absence. In many cases, it represents a decision made in a specific emotional moment, influenced by timing, perception, or external factors. As time passes, those factors can change, leading to a reassessment of feelings or curiosity about what was left unexplored. This is why some people reappear after distancing themselves. However, it is important to understand that returning does not always mean restored interest in the same way it is initially interpreted. Motivation for returning can vary widely, and understanding these motivations requires awareness rather than assumption. Sometimes it is curiosity, sometimes comparison, sometimes emotional reflection, and sometimes unresolved connection dynamics that were never fully processed. In this breakdown, we will explore the psychological reasons why women may come back after rejecting someone. These insights are not about generalizing behavior, but about understanding patterns in attraction, emotional processing, and decision reversal. The goal is to bring clarity to a situation that often feels unpredictable, so that responses can be grounded, balanced, and emotionally aware rather than reactive or assumption-driven. 1. Emotional reassessment over time. One of the most common psychological reasons a woman may come back after rejecting you is emotional reassessment over time. Initial rejection is often not the final or fully processed emotional conclusion, but rather a decision made in a specific moment based on limited perspective, emotional state, or external circumstances. Human attraction is not static, and feelings can shift once distance creates space for reflection. When someone steps away from an interaction, they are no longer influenced by immediate pressure, social dynamics, or situational tension, which allows their mind to revisit the experience with a different emotional lens. In that reflective space, details that were previously overlooked or undervalued may begin to appear more significant. This does not mean the original rejection was insincere, but it does mean it may not have been fully final in emotional processing. Over time, memory tends to soften certain negative impressions and highlight positive aspects, especially if there was meaningful connection or emotional engagement present during interaction. Another important factor is comparison. After rejecting someone, a woman may engage in new interactions or explore other options, which creates a reference point for comparison. If those new experiences do not match or exceed the emotional quality of the previous connection, it can trigger reconsideration of earlier decisions. This comparison is not always conscious, but it plays a role in how attraction is evaluated after distance. Emotional reassessment also occurs when life circumstances change. Stress, personal growth, shifting priorities, or changes in emotional availability can alter how past relationships are viewed. What once felt unimportant or uncertain may later appear more stable or meaningful in hindsight. This is why time plays a critical role in emotional decisions. However, it is important to understand that emotional reassessment does not guarantee genuine intention to reconnect in a meaningful way. Sometimes returning is driven by curiosity rather than commitment, or by emotional nostalgia rather than clear intention. This is why observation of behavior matters more than interpretation of return itself. Another key aspect is unresolved emotional processing. In some cases, rejection happens before emotional closure is fully developed. This means the connection is not completely mentally or emotionally resolved, even if the interaction ended externally. When unresolved emotional threads remain, the mind may revisit them later, leading to renewed contact or curiosity. This is a natural part of how human memory and emotion work, especially in situations where the connection has emotional depth or strong engagement. Stoic awareness emphasizes that emotional shifts are normal and should not be immediately assigned meaning without context. A return after rejection is not automatically a signal of regret, true interest, or changed intention. It is simply a change in emotional perspective that must be evaluated through consistent behavior rather than assumption. Many men misinterpret return as validation of initial value, but the reality is more complex. The same person who rejected you and returns later may be operating from a completely different emotional state than before. This is why grounding interpretation in present behavior is essential. Emotional reassessment explains why attraction can appear inconsistent over time, but it does not eliminate the need for clarity in actions. Ultimately, people revisit past connections because human emotion is fluid, not fixed. Distance allows reflection, reflection allows comparison, and comparison can lead to reconsideration. But whether that reconsideration leads to meaningful reconnection depends entirely on current behavior, consistency, and mutual intent, rather than past emotional fluctuations or temporary shifts in perception that occur naturally in human psychology over time, across changing circumstances and evolving emotional states within interpersonal relationships that develop and dissolve through ongoing interaction and reflection in real social environments, consistently experienced by individuals navigating attraction and connection dynamics in everyday life situations. 2. Curiosity after closure. Another psychological reason a woman may come back after rejecting you is simple curiosity after closure. Once a connection ends or is perceived as ended, the absence of access often triggers curiosity about what is no longer available. This is a natural human response to separation and uncertainty. When someone is no longer actively present in daily interaction, the mind begins to fill gaps with questions such as how that person is doing, whether they have changed, or what the outcome would be if communication resumed. This curiosity is not always rooted in deep emotional attachment, but it can still be strong enough to motivate reconnection attempts. In many cases, rejection creates a sense of finality in one moment, but over time that finality becomes less emotionally rigid. Without ongoing interaction, the intensity of the original decision fades, and curiosity begins to replace certainty. This shift can lead a woman to revisit the idea of reconnecting, not necessarily because her feelings have fully changed, but because she wants to test or explore what has happened since the separation. Another important factor is uncertainty resolution. The human mind dislikes incomplete narratives, and when a connection ends without full emotional closure or clarity, it can leave behind unanswered questions. Curiosity then becomes a way of resolving those unanswered elements. This does not automatically indicate romantic intent, but rather a psychological desire to reduce ambiguity. In some situations, social media or indirect updates can also amplify curiosity. Seeing glimpses of your life without direct interaction can create interest in what has changed, especially if there is visible growth, improvement, or emotional stability. However, curiosity should not be mistaken for commitment or genuine readiness to rebuild a connection. It is important to distinguish between interest in information and interest in emotional reconnection. Curiosity is often exploratory, while genuine reconnection requires consistent effort and behavioral alignment. Another key point is emotional distance. When time passes after rejection, emotional intensity naturally decreases. This reduction in emotional charge can make it easier to revisit past interactions without the pressure that existed during the initial decision. What once felt certain may begin to feel open for reconsideration simply because the emotional weight has changed. This does not mean the original rejection was incorrect, but it does show how emotional states evolve over time. Stoic awareness encourages recognizing curiosity as a neutral psychological process rather than immediately assigning meaning to it. Just because someone returns or reaches out does not mean their underlying intentions are fully formed or stable. Curiosity can lead to reconnection, but it can also fade quickly once the initial interest is satisfied. This is why behavior after return is more important than the return itself. Consistency, clarity, and sustained engagement are what reveal genuine intent, not initial curiosity or short-term interest. Another aspect to consider is personal growth perception. If a woman notices change or improvement in your behavior, appearance, or emotional stability after distance, curiosity may increase because the version of you she once knew no longer feels the same. This can trigger renewed interest in understanding who you are now compared to before. However, even in this case, curiosity alone does not guarantee emotional investment. It simply opens the door for reevaluation. Ultimately, curiosity after closure is a natural part of human psychology. People revisit what they no longer have access to because absence creates space for reflection and imagination. But it is essential to interpret this correctly. Curiosity is not a commitment signal. It is a psychological response to distance, uncertainty, and change over time in human relationships where emotional memory interacts with present perception and evolving understanding of past interactions that were once emotionally significant but are now viewed through a different lens of time, separation, and personal reflection in ongoing social and relational contexts that continue to shift as individuals grow, change, and reassess their experiences in complex interpersonal dynamics across different stages of emotional development and awareness in real-life situations. 3. Change circumstances and timing. Another important reason a woman may come back after rejecting you is a change in circumstances and timing. Human decisions are often heavily influenced by the situation at the moment they are made, rather than being fixed expressions of permanent preference. At the time of rejection, external factors such as emotional availability, personal priorities, social environment, stress levels, or relationship expectations can strongly influence how someone perceives a connection. When those conditions change, the way that same connection is viewed can also change significantly. This is why timing plays a critical role in attraction and relationship decisions. What may not have felt right in one phase of life can begin to feel different in another phase when emotional or situational context shifts. For example, a woman may reject someone because she is focused on other priorities, emotionally unavailable, or not ready for connection at that moment. Later, when those pressures reduce or her emotional state stabilizes, she may revisit past interactions with a different mindset. This does not necessarily mean the original rejection was wrong, but rather that the conditions influencing that decision have evolved. Another key factor is life progression. As people grow, their standards, expectations, and emotional needs can change. A connection that was previously dismissed may later appear more compatible with current life direction. This shift is not always conscious. It often happens gradually as individuals reassess what they want versus what they previously prioritized. In some cases, external experiences also influence this reassessment. New relationships or social interactions may not meet expectations, leading to reflection on earlier connections that felt more stable or emotionally grounded. This comparison is not always intentional, but occurs naturally as part of evaluating relational satisfaction over time. Another important aspect is availability. Emotional and practical availability can fluctuate. Someone who is not ready to invest in a connection earlier may become more open later due to changes in workload, emotional healing, or personal circumstances. This shift in availability can reopen interest in previous connections that were previously set aside. However, it is important to understand that a return driven by timing or circumstance does not automatically indicate deep emotional realization or long-term intent. It simply reflects that the conditions that once influenced rejection are no longer present in the same way. Stoic awareness emphasizes the importance of not overinterpreting timing-based returns. Just because someone becomes available again does not mean the underlying compatibility has fundamentally changed. It means the external and internal conditions surrounding the decision have shifted. This distinction is crucial because many people confuse changed circumstances with changed intention. Another factor is emotional reset. Over time, emotional intensity fades, and decisions made under strong emotional influence can feel less rigid in hindsight. This creates space for reevaluation without the same emotional pressure that existed during the original rejection. When pressure is removed, individuals can reassess the connection more objectively, sometimes leading to renewed contact or curiosity. However, renewed interest based on timing should always be evaluated through consistent behavior rather than assumption. If circumstances alone are responsible for the return, then the stability of that reconnection depends on whether underlying compatibility and intent are truly aligned now, not just whether timing has improved. Ultimately, changed circumstances and timing explain many cases of return after rejection because human decisions are deeply context-dependent. People evolve, environments shift, and emotional readiness fluctuates. What matters most is not the return itself, but whether current behavior shows sustained interest, clarity, and consistency beyond temporary situational change that may influence perception and interaction patterns over time in relationships where timing, readiness, and emotional availability continuously shape decisions, connections, and the direction of interpersonal dynamics in ways that are not fixed but fluid and responsive to changing life conditions and personal development stages experienced by individuals navigating attraction, rejection, and reconnection in real social environments where emotional states and external pressures interact to influence relationship outcomes across different periods of life experience and evolving personal priorities. 4. Comparison with other men. Another psychological reason a woman may come back after rejecting you is comparison with other men. After rejecting someone, it is common for individuals to continue social interaction, explore new connections, or engage in different dating experiences. These new experiences often become a reference point for comparison, even if it is not done consciously. When a woman encounters other men after a rejection, she begins to evaluate differences in behavior, emotional connection, communication style, consistency, and overall relational satisfaction. If those new interactions do not meet or exceed the emotional or psychological standard of the previous connection, it can lead to reevaluation of the earlier decision. This does not necessarily mean the original rejection was a mistake, but it does mean perception is evolving based on new data. Human attraction is often relative rather than absolute. People do not evaluate others in isolation, but through comparison with recent experiences. This is why earlier connections can sometimes regain relevance after exposure to less satisfying alternatives. Another important factor is emotional contrast. If new interactions feel inconsistent, superficial, or emotionally unfulfilling, the memory of a more stable or meaningful past connection can become more significant. This contrast effect can increase curiosity or interest in revisiting previous relationships even after rejection. However, it is important to understand that comparison does not always lead to genuine emotional return. Sometimes it is simply a mental evaluation process rather than a clear decision to reconnect with intent. In some cases, comparison is influenced by novelty fatigue. New interactions may initially feel exciting, but later reveal limitations in emotional depth or compatibility. When this happens, the mind naturally recalls earlier connections that felt more comfortable or emotionally aligned. This can create a temporary shift in interest back towards someone previously rejected. Another factor is idealization after experience. Over time, the memory of a past connection can become selectively positive, especially if current experiences are less satisfying. This does not mean the past relationship was objectively better, but rather that the emotional mind tends to emphasize certain qualities when contrasting different experiences. Stoic awareness encourages understanding comparison as a psychological process rather than a definitive indicator of intent. Just because someone begins to reconsider you after other experiences does not mean their feelings are fully stable or aligned with long-term commitment. It simply means their evaluation criteria have shifted based on new comparisons. Another important point is self-perception shift. When a woman sees how different men treat her, communicate with her, or engage emotionally, it can alter how she perceives her own past decisions. This reflection can lead to reconsideration, especially if the previous connection offered qualities that are now missing. However, this reconsideration must always be measured against consistent behavior in the present, not just retrospective comparison. A return driven by comparison is often unstable unless it is supported by clear and consistent intention moving forward. Without that, it remains a fluctuation in preference rather than a grounded relational decision. Ultimately, comparison with other men is a powerful psychological factor because it continuously reshapes perception of past and present connections. It influences how attraction is evaluated over time and can trigger reconsideration of previously rejected relationships. However, awareness is essential. Not all returns based on comparison indicate genuine readiness for reconnection. Some are temporary reflections driven by contrast, novelty loss, or emotional recalibration rather than stable commitment or long-term relational clarity. 5. Ego, reversal, and validation. Seeking. Another psychological reason a woman may come back after rejecting you is ego reversal combined with validation seeking. After a rejection, both people in an interaction continue to process the emotional outcome internally, even if they appear to have moved on externally. In some cases, the act of rejecting someone can later create curiosity about how that person responded, adapted, or emotionally handled the situation. This curiosity is not always rooted in deep romantic interest, but sometimes in a desire to confirm personal impact. When a woman notices that the person she rejected has not reacted with desperation, over-pursuit, or emotional collapse, it can shift her perception of him. This shift is not necessarily about love or compatibility, but about psychological validation. Human beings are naturally curious about how much influence they have had on others, especially in emotionally charged situations like rejection. If she expects a certain reaction and does not receive it, it can create cognitive dissonance. That dissonance may lead to revisiting the interaction to reassess what it meant. In some cases, this reassessment can manifest as renewed contact or indirect engagement. Another important factor is ego reinforcement. When someone rejects another person, they often create an internal narrative that justifies the decision. Over time, that narrative can be challenged if new information suggests the rejected person has value, growth, or emotional stability that was not fully recognized at the time. This can lead to a subtle ego adjustment where the initial judgment is reconsidered. However, this does not always translate into genuine relational intent. Sometimes, it is simply an internal correction of perception rather than a desire to rebuild connection. Validation seeking also plays a role. After rejection, some individuals may unconsciously check whether their decision was correct by observing the other person's behavior or changes over time. If the rejected person appears unaffected, improved, or socially validated elsewhere, it can trigger curiosity or re-engagement. This is because external validation often influences internal certainty. If that certainty becomes challenged, it can reopen interest that was previously closed. Another layer is emotional impact awareness. People sometimes return to see whether they still hold emotional significance in someone's life. This is not always conscious manipulation or intent, but rather a psychological check of relevance. It answers the question of whether their absence still creates effect or whether the connection has fully dissolved. Stoic awareness emphasizes that ego-based returns should not be confused with stable emotional investment. Just because someone comes back to reassess impact does not mean they are returning with consistent intention or clarity. It may simply be a moment of psychological reflection driven by curiosity about personal influence. Another key point is behavioral inconsistency. Ego and validation-driven returns can fluctuate quickly because they are not always rooted in deep emotional resolution. They may appear suddenly and fade just as quickly once the validation need is satisfied or once uncertainty is resolved. This makes it important to evaluate not the return itself, but the consistency of behavior after the return. If engagement is unstable, it often indicates that the motivation is still internal validation rather than relational commitment. Ultimately, ego reversal and validation seeking explain why some women return after rejecting someone, not because feelings have fully changed, but because psychological curiosity, self-perception, and the need to reassess personal impact come into play. These factors influence behavior in subtle ways and can lead to renewed contact even when long-term intent is unclear. Understanding this helps prevent misinterpretation of temporary re-engagement as definitive emotional change. In the end, when a woman comes back after rejecting you, the most important thing to understand is not the return itself, but the reason behind it and the consistency that follows. Human psychology is fluid, and attraction is influenced by time, comparison, memory, ego, curiosity, and changing life circumstances. Because of this, a return does not automatically mean a clear or stable intention to rebuild a relationship. It may simply reflect emotional recalibration, testing behavior, nostalgia, or shifting external conditions that temporarily alter perception. Stoic thinking emphasizes the importance of staying grounded in observable behavior rather than interpreting emotional signals in isolation. Many men make the mistake of treating a return as validation, when in reality it is often just another phase of evaluation. The real truth of any reconnection is revealed after the return, not at the moment it happens. Consistency, clarity, respect, and sustained effort are what determine whether the connection has genuine direction or is simply a temporary emotional fluctuation. It is also important to avoid over-investing emotionally too quickly when someone reappears after distance. Without clear behavioral alignment, the same patterns that led to rejection in the first place may still exist. Awareness protects you from repeating cycles of confusion and emotional imbalance. Instead of reacting with excitement or assumption, a grounded response is to observe calmly and allow actions to define meaning over time. In many cases, the return is less about you being suddenly more valuable and more about her perspective changing due to internal or external shifts. Understanding this distinction keeps you from misinterpreting temporary emotional movement as permanent relational change. Ultimately, clarity comes from patience, not reaction, and from behavior, not words, especially in complex emotional dynamics like this.